If it's the 15th of the month, that means it's time to take a dive into my weird record collection.
Where's your mama gone?
Where's your mama gone?
Where's the baby gone?
Little baby gone.
Where's your mama gone?
Where's your mama gone?
Far, far away.
Hey everybody, it's the 15th of the month, so you know what time it is. It's time for episode 17 of my weird record collection. I'm Sean, and I'm coming to you from the north side of the city of Chicago, and I hereby invite you into my odd world of strange, miscellaneous, and otherwise uncategorizable media for your turntable. Here in episode 17, we're going to be talking about a musical compilation called Smash Hits 71 on the UK-based Music for Pleasure label. Before I get into that, though, I just want to comment on a little bit of feedback I received. I did hear from somebody lamenting that we will no longer be hearing Richard J. Daley's malapropism.
The policeman isn't there to create disorder. The policeman is there to preserve disorder.
One of my favorites, to be sure, but I don't want it to be overdone, so I had to make the decision to swap it out. Now, obviously, in episodes like this, where I didn't really use the theme music, that wasn't even really... It was kind of a moot point here, but still, I just wanted to address it and say I acknowledge your appreciation for that, and I appreciate your appreciation, but I just figured better switch it out before it got too stale. And I'll be switching out samples here and there as I feel the occasion demands. Just something I got to do to keep things fresh, you know? But if I get enough demand, I'll bring it back. So we'll see what happens. But in the meantime, I'm recording this just after Record Store Day happened. It was April, I'm recording this on the 14th. Yeah, I'm cutting it close for the 15th release. That would have been the 12th then, April 12th, Saturday. And there were a couple of releases that I wanted. So I went to my neighborhood record store, which is Rattleback Records in Chicago. And I realize that I'm probably doxing myself by giving that away. People can probably triangulate my address now. Oh, well. But the way they do things at Rattleback is they open early at 9 o'clock. I think they usually open at 10 on Saturdays. And there's usually a huge line, just like you would imagine. So I got up at 6 a.m., took a shower, and had a quick nibble. I had a banana and a glass of tea. And rode my bike over to Rattleback, a short ride. Only took a few minutes, thankfully, and there was already a line. Now, where Rattleback is, it's at the intersection, or near the intersection, I should say, of Clark Street and Balmoral Avenue. And the line wrapped all the way to the end of the block over at Rasher Street, or is it Rasher Avenue? I'm not sure. And it curved a little bit. It turned around. Now, what was interesting is we had all this big line, and there's a coffee shop on the corner, and it's open. But I was wondering why they didn't have people come outside and take orders and bring orders for people outside in the line. That would have made them a lot of money, probably. It's something they should consider. I think I got there at 7:19, and the line only got longer, of course. And there were people up at the front who were obviously camping out from the night before. You could tell by how, unwashed they looked, and they were sitting in beach chairs. And what they do is usually, I think about half hour before opening, is they hand out spreadsheets to everybody, spreadsheets and pens. And they say, here's the list of the titles we have. Put a check next to the title that you want. And I was a little concerned because one of the albums I was wanting to get was the Makaha sessions with Wrecking Crew people. My apologies to Carol K if she's hearing this, but sorry, that's what everybody calls it, so people understand what we're referring to. But it has Hal Blaine, Jerry Cole, and Don Randy, who were very in-demand session players in Hollywood. And they recorded a bunch of songs together, and that was being released for Record Store Day, but that wasn't listed on the spreadsheet, so I was a bit concerned. So I put some check marks by what I wanted. There were 2 Vince Guaraldi releases, Peanuts related. There was a Record Store Day edition of Jazz Impressions of a Boy Named Charlie Brown, which I put a check next to, but I was a little bit on the fence about because I'd heard the album before, and it's not one of my favorites. I don't really like it all that much. That was the soundtrack to an unaired documentary from 1964 or maybe 1963. They filmed the documentary and then they decided not to air it, but they released the soundtrack album anyway just to recoup some of the costs. The documentary is available. You can get it on DVD. You might have to get it through the Charles Schulz Museum in Santa Rosa, but it is available on DVD. I don't know if it's streaming. And I have seen it. It's a good documentary, but I'm not a big fan of the soundtrack. But I figured, maybe I'll give it another shot. And the other Vince Guaraldi album was the soundtrack to It's the Easter Beagle, Charlie Brown, which I didn't realize Vince Guaraldi was still alive when that special was made. The Lee Mendelssohn's offspring have been releasing soundtracks to all kinds of Peanuts specials that Vince Guaraldi provided the music for. And I love them. They sound great. If you have never heard them before, but you've heard A Charlie Brown Christmas, you've heard that album, it's nothing like A Charlie Brown Christmas, mainly because when they recorded the A Charlie Brown Christmas music, there was already an intent to put out a companion album, so there are complete songs on it. Not the case with the other Peanuts specials. They did not intend to release soundtrack albums, so the soundtrack albums that have been coming out for the past few years, it's nothing but musical cues, because for the most part, there weren't complete songs, just like the background music, but it's still really good, and I really like it. And there was also, the album is in the same room with me, but I don't feel like taking off my headphones to go look at the title, but The Doors' Strange Days 1967, I think it's called, which is some outtakes from the sessions. I think they made their debut on Record Store Day, and it might be just a limited time thing. And I love the Strange Days album. It's a great album, so I put a check mark next to that. And there was an album released by the Rock-afire Explosion. If you don't recognize that name, the Rock-afire Explosion was the audio animatronic band that was at Showbiz Pizza Place. I put a check mark next to that, not for me, but literally for a friend who wanted it and asked me if I could grab a copy from him because he was pretty sure his store wasn't going to get it. So I said, sure, I'll get it. And I also put a check mark next to Stray Voltage by Sun Ra. There was another Sun Ra collection out that day. It was 5 records, but man, I didn't want to pay 5 record set money. I'm currently unemployed and I wanted to get some records, but I didn't want to overdo it, because, I want to make sure my finances are still decent. So far they are. I'm thankful for that. But the thing about Sun Ra is I'd always heard of Sun Ra, but I never heard his music until after the previous Record Store Day. Now, here's the thing. When I went to the store on Record Store Day, April of last year, 2024, I noticed that everybody in the store except me had at least one Sun Ra album. I'm thinking, okay, this must be really good. Now, the thing is, November of 2024, Record Store Day was on Black Friday. In fact, usually in November, Record Store Day is Black Friday, which is a problem for me because I'm usually traveling on Black Friday. My mother-in-law lives in New Jersey, so my wife Lisa and we fly out to New Jersey to spend Thanksgiving with her, and we come back on Black Friday. So while Black Friday is happening, we are going to the airport, so I can never make it to Record Store Day. So I went to Rattleback the next day and went through the leftover Record Store Day albums that they had, and there was one Sun Ra album left over, a 2-record live set that I think was from New Orleans, if I'm not mistaken. So I bought it out of curiosity, and I friggin' loved it. It's like experimental jazz, and the way it was performed, I was fascinated. I absolutely loved it. So I wanted to make sure I walked out with a Sun Ra record this time. And there was one place I went to when I was lamenting how I can never do Record Store Day on Black Friday because I'm always traveling. And the store owner said, well, if that happens again, call me after noon and let me know what you want. And if I have any left over, I'll set them aside for you. He said, after noon, we're pretty safe to go ahead and reserve things. But during the initial hours, we're not allowed to. So, yeah. But the way that Rattleback Records works on Record Store Day is you get in line outside. And when the store opens, They allow up to, I think, however their legal maximum capacity is to come into the store. And you line up, you go to the counter, and you hand your spreadsheet to somebody behind the counter who goes through your spreadsheet, calls out the records you want, and then somebody hands you the records, assuming they're still available. By the time I got to the counter, there were no Vince Guaraldi's left, and I was really bummed out by that. And they also didn't have the Makaha sessions. I said, I didn't see that on your spreadsheet. Is that an oversight? He said, no, they just didn't send us any. Cripe. And then what you do after you get your record is you go back into another line to check out. And the store isn't really open for standard browsing during the initial record store day rush. In fact, they even have like velvet ropes up to kind of guide you through the store. So you go exactly where they want you to go. And usually what my modus operandi would be was to go to Rattleback, who opens at 10 for record store day. And if they didn't have something that I wanted, I'd then ride my bike over to Laurie's Planet of Sound, which is just a couple of miles away. And they open at 10. Unfortunately, this year that was not an option. Number one, because Laurie's opened at 9 too. And number two, because I needed to be home because my wife had to go out and I needed to do some things while she was out. So yeah, it was a little bit of a bummer. It turns out that the friend that I bought the Rock-afire Explosion album for, he was able to get me a copy of the Makaha sessions. So we're going to do an even swap for that. And I went online to see if there were any copies of It's the Easter Beagle, Charlie Brown on eBay and anywhere else. There were, but they were price gouging. They were mostly $125 and above, when at the store they would have been like $30. And I was like, screw this. I'm not going to, no way. It's not worth it. But then I found out there were two versions of it released for non-record store day. One on black vinyl, one on purple vinyl. So I found someone who had the purple vinyl and I ordered it. The record store day version was egg-shaped. And I remember telling Lisa about that. And she said, well, isn't a shaped record not as good as a round record? No, that has nothing to do with it. Shape has nothing to do with it. The only things that'll affect how a record can get its best possible sound is, number one, the quality of the vinyl. Color and shape don't matter. Picture disc might matter because of the process that needs to be done to, I talked about that in a previous episode. But color doesn't matter. Shape doesn't matter. What does matter is the mastering, the quality of the vinyl, and whether it's actually pressed perfectly centered on the vinyl. That's all that matters. Shape doesn't matter. But still, I'm actually glad I didn't end up with the egg-shaped vinyl, because I can tell you from personal experience, I mentioned in the last episode, I think, how every time a new record comes into our house, I give it a cleaning in the spin clean machine before I actually play it. Shaped records are a pain to try to clean in a spin clean, because a spin clean is designed for perfectly round records. It's not designed for oval, or if you have that Barnes and Barnes album, it's not designed for a fish head shape. It's difficult to clean if it's not just a flat disc. So yeah. Anyway, I'm sorry to ramble on like that. Now that I'm done talking about Record Store Day, how about I talk about today's featured record? I mentioned that this record is on the Music for Pleasure label. Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Music for Pleasure, its history, and what it's all about. Music for Pleasure, or MFP, as it's often abbreviated, including in the logo, it started in 1965 when a publisher named Paul Hamlin formed a partnership with EMI. Now, who's Paul Hamlin? Wonderful question. He was born Paul Bertrand Wolfgang Hamburger on February 12, 1926 in Berlin to a pediatrician father and a Quaker mother. The family left Germany when the Nazis came into power, and they settled into St. John's Wood in London, which happens to be the home of where EMI's recording studios were, now famously called Abbey Road. But anyway, after Paul's father died in 1940, Paul changed his last name to Hamlin, which was a name he picked out of a phone book. He started publishing in 1949 by selling books out of a wheelbarrow in the Camden borough of London. He became a highly successful book publisher, and his strategy was to cater to non-literary customers by using, well, very colorful photographs in his books, which was not very common back then because it was quite expensive to do so, but that strategy paid off. He offered his publications not only in the usual bookstores, but also in places you'd not likely expect to find a lot of books, like hardware stores and grocery stores. And Hamlin was quite a charitable guy, and he established the Paul Hamlin Foundation in 1987, and now it's one of the biggest charitable organizations in England. He was dubbed a Commander of the British Empire in 1993 and has had multiple libraries named after him. He died on August 31st, 2001. Getting back to music for pleasure, well, here's a description I found on a defunct website called Vinyl Vulture. And I'll put a link to that site via archive.org on my show notes. I will read you what they have to say about music for pleasure. And I quote, "Music for pleasure, MFP, the three letters that perhaps best denote the bringing together of all things both cheap, in quotation marks, and at the same time, also in quotation marks, nasty. Whether we like it or not, every man-jack of us has got at least one MFP album tucked away. A scattergun approach of releases to make grandma giddy and keep the kiddies quiet at one and the same time. MFP had it all. Hundreds of albums released over the best part of 20 years, in an approach that did much to change the public perception of recorded music from a high-cost prestige leisure purchase to an impulse buy at the checkout." I highly recommend looking at the Vinyl Vulture website, though. They have a lot, and I mean a lot, to say about music for pleasure. But anyway, that label was started in Middlesex, London, headquartered in what was called Astronaut House. And in fact, that, I believe, was actually listed as the address on the back of some of their albums, Astronaut House. And that label gained attention early on when it released 78 albums at the same time. Again, 78 albums at once, with a cost of 9 shillings and 6 pennies. That's about 11 pounds in today's money, $12 American. And back then, that was at a time when albums would typically cost around 32 shillings, which is about 18 pounds or $23 in today's money. Those 78 records that were put out, not 78 RPM, 78 individual albums that came out, they were split up into two series. There was the 1000 series, which contained popular music, and the 2000 series, which contained classical music recordings that were performed by Eastern European orchestras. Later on, Music for Pleasure had kind of a subsidiary label called Classics for Pleasure that specialized in, of course, that kind of music. Now, remember Paul Hamlin's book strategy that I talked about a couple of minutes ago? Well, that strategy was also applied to record album covers. They were colorful and they were made to attract the eye. Couple that with a low price, and you have customers who normally wouldn't buy a lot of records because of the cost. Now they're suddenly buying Music for Pleasure records because they're cheap. There were some problems at the start, one in particular being settling royalty payments. The Paul Hamlin Publishing Company assumed that EMI was handling royalties. EMI thought that Hamlin was handling royalties, so they had to get that sorted out. But it turns out that Music for Pleasure actually operated successfully, and they eventually sold their music on CDs as well. And by all accounts, CDs made by Music for Pleasure sound phenomenal. Things started to take a tumble, however, in the mid-90s, and then EMI absorbed the Music for Pleasure label and their sales staff and rebranded the label as EMI Gold. The Music for Pleasure label made a brief comeback later on, but quietly disappeared for good, well, so far at least, back in 2012. Some of the artists that Music for Pleasure reissued over the years include the Beatles, both group and solo, Frank Sinatra, the Beach Boys, Pink Floyd, Roger Whittaker, Kenny Rogers, The Animals, Herman's Hermits, among others. Now, one of the things that Music for Pleasure also did was to release albums of anonymous studio musicians performing well-known songs. something that another label called Pickwick was also doing at around the same time. In fact, the Pickwick and Music for Pleasure stories have a lot of overlap. Now, one thing in particular I have to talk about in regards to Smash Hits 71 is BWD Productions, who is in charge of Smash Hits 71 and numerous other albums. So let's learn a little bit about them as well, shall we? Of course we shall. Now, this BW of BWD is Bill Wellings, who in 1962 came up with an idea. Now, he was an ad man who worked at J. Walter Thompson, an agency over in London, but he was getting kind of tired of writing ads and selling other people's properties, so he went around to some of London's most renowned recording studios and rounded up as many of the top session musicians that he could and booked some studio time, especially during the overnight hours when rates were the cheapest, and he would have sound-alike versions recorded of these hits. Now, this Smash Hits 71 album is actually a compilation primarily from other albums put out by Music for Pleasure. In the early 70s, Music for Pleasure would actually put out, I believe, every month, a new compilation of these cheapo knockoff re-recordings of hits, and they all had something similar in common. They had a picture of a very attractive, scantily clad woman on the front, undoubtedly to give people a reason to buy the record. If customers thought they were about to hear Three Dog Night singing Black and White and were disappointed to learn that it was not Three Dog Night but a imitation, at least they had an attractive lady to look at on the album cover. And usually they were kind of sports themed. Like, for example, Hot Hits 6, which is one of the many albums that were put out in the early 70s, which actually contains a couple of songs that would end up on Smash Hits 71, namely Bannerman and Chirpy Chirpy Cheep Cheep. You're going to hear me say this again later, but man, British and American tastes were so different in the early 70s. But the cover of Hot Hits 6 has a woman wearing a very skimpy, it looks like basically a two-piece bathing suit in off-white, and she's holding a cricket bat and wearing what I believe are knee protectors that are used in cricket. I know nothing about cricket, so. Now, the thing about these budget albums of remade music, they were kind of falling in demand by around 1975 after about 10 years of being part of the Music for Pleasure label, partly because you had things like Now That's What I Call Music and the K-Tel Records compilations, which actually were discount records featuring original artists. There wasn't really any need for these hot hits and smash hits albums. So 1976 happens, and Bill Wellings finds himself being a record producer now, and he no longer had his production business that supplied Music for Pleasure with these compilations. Now, you're going to hear me refer to Bill as a she now because he underwent gender surgery and changed his name to Molly, and there really wasn't much known about now Molly Wellings after, say, 1980, other than it's believed that she had a successful theater career and got romantically involved with one of Margaret Thatcher's staffers, and she died in December of 2010. So it's really fascinating the things that you learn when you do a podcast such as this. But now that we have a little bit of background on Music for Pleasure, Paul Hamlin, and Bill and Molly Wellings, let's talk about the record Smash Hits 71.
Oh, my darling, knock 3 times on the ceiling if you want me.
Now, since this is primarily an audio podcast, and I'm assuming most people are listening through some kind of audio medium as opposed to the YouTube version of this podcast, I should describe what this album looks like. I have it in my hands now. The cover, it's British, and something I noticed about British and other, actually I think all European album covers is unlike American record covers, they're not thick cardboard. They're kind of flimsy and floppy and glossy, very glossy, and this one is no exception. It was printed by Garrett and Lofthouse, which if you have any British-made albums in your collection from a certain period of time, up until probably the 80s, chances are the cover was made by Garrett and Lofthouse. The front cover on the top is the title in kind of a reddish, almost pinkish, kind of a maroonish color in a slightly serifed font. It says Smash Hits 71. And then to the right of that, you have the Music for Pleasure logo in a nice shade of blue, a light blue. And above that, also in light blue, is MFP Stereo 5229. And the background color of the cover is a kind of a sky blue. And on the left, there's a big picture of a woman wearing apparently nothing but bikini bottoms with orange and white stripes, and there's a giant diaper pin going through those bikini bottoms. In fact, it might just be a diaper for all we know. She has what looks to be a 1-year-old baby in her arms, strategically placed, and the baby looks kind of frightened. If you flip the cover over, the back cover is essentially the same thing, except she's actually wearing a different set of bikini slash diaper. It's a more floral design with some orange, brown, and yellow, and the top matches, the top which is barely visible, by the way. On the front cover to the right of this scantily clad woman is the track listing in the same color as the title, and that's all the front cover has, just the title, the logo, catalog number, the track list, just the titles of the songs, nothing else. And of course, this big picture of a scantily clad attractive woman with a scared looking baby. And the back cover, same background color, except maybe a little bit lighter than the sky blue on the front cover. This one, it has a similar layout. It's got the woman and the baby on the left, and on the right, it says in black font, Smash Hits 71, and then it has a slightly more reader-friendly track listing where it indicates side 1, the track numbers, side 2, the track numbers, and of course the titles. On the very bottom, you have what's pretty typical for the bottom of a back record cover. It basically has generic record company information, such as the Circle P sound copyright symbol, 1971, a BWD production. And this is interesting. Now, my wife Lisa and I have another Music for Pleasure record in our collection, and it is that label's version of the Beach Boys Today, except they simply titled it Do You Want to Dance, which is the first song on the record. We were out and about with a friend of ours at a record store in Chicago that sadly no longer exists. I think it's the recently departed Dave's Records. And we saw that record, and it looked weird because it had a strange picture of the Beach Boys on the cover from 1968, 1969, taken in Utah. And they're posing with some guy that they met up with. I forgot his name. If you're watching the YouTube version of this, you'll see the name in the caption here. But regardless, because the three of us are kind of silly, we referred to that record as the Ook Op record. And I'll tell you why. If you look at the back cover on the Music for Pleasure records, or at least most of them, in the little mono stereo texts that a lot of album covers have telling you the wonders of stereo and that it's still compatible with mono, it's in different languages, and the first one is in Dutch, actually, and it looks like it says Ook Op in it, O-O-K-O-P. It actually reads, Deze stereo LP kan ook op een moderne plattenspeler gedraaid worden, which means this stereo LP can also be played on a modern turntable. I've been studying Dutch for a couple of years, so yeah, it's kind of why I know how to pronounce the G that weird way. But anyway, that same notice appears on the back of Smash Hits 71. Now, a little bit ago, I mentioned how Music for Pleasure records had an address of Astronaut House. Well, this one does not. There's no mention of Astronaut House. It simply says Amsterdam, Brussels, Johannesburg, Cologne, London, Paris, Sydney. Doesn't have the address in here, so that's all it is. It does have an EMI logo at the bottom, though, manufactured by EMI, right below the Music for Pleasure logo. The record is a standard medium thickness black vinyl 12-incher with a dark gray background label with a red egg shape in the middle, and inside the red is all the pertinent information, the track listing, the publishing credits, And let's see, does it have the songwriting credits as well? It does. It has the songwriting credits. So yeah, there we go. And before I go any further, I'm just going to answer this question that might be on your mind. Sean, where did you get this record and why did you get this record? I got this record on June 18th, 2024, when Lisa and I were in London. We took an Uber water taxi over to Greenwich and walked around Greenwich. And there was a street in Greenwich. I don't remember the name of the street off the top of my head, but it's one of the main streets that has a lot of businesses on it. There are actually two record stores almost next door to each other. They were very close to each other. And the record store where I bought this is called Music and Goods Exchange. There are actually at least two locations in London, maybe even more. The one we went to is in Greenwich, of course. And the thing about that store, and in fact, I think that's true for a lot of record stores in London, is that the records aren't really sorted very strictly alphabetically like I usually see, which is actually pretty cool because you kind of know where stuff is you want to look at, and you basically flip through and discover things. And I brought back a nice collection of records from that trip too because of that. But I happened upon Smash Hits 71, and I was taken aback by how bizarre the whole thing seemed. I assumed, correctly as it turns out, that this was going to be one of those records of anonymous studio musicians performing knockoffs of well-known songs, and I was absolutely right. I bought it for that reason because it was weird. I thought this would be podcast material. Well, hey, you're listening right now. And also, I knew that Elton John started his professional music career by performing on music like this. He's not on this album, by the way. I found out when I got home. But it actually turns out that Elton did record a few tracks for Music for Pleasure, specifically on the album Hits 70.
My baby loves love, my baby loves love, and she's got what it takes, and she knows how to use it. My baby.
He sang on 3 tracks, 2 as lead vocalist, even though I think most of his session work was for other budget labels, and even then, after he had already launched his recording career, he already had an album or 2 out. Ever heard of David Bowie? Yep. He started out as a session musician for Music for Pleasure in the 60s, kind of like how Lou Reed started out as a professional session player for Pickwick. Crazy how things turn out. So yeah, I bought this for £1, maybe £2, but I'm pretty sure it was £1. So shows you how valuable this thing is. And when I got it home and played it, I was surprised at how good it sounded. It played back well. It had some vinyl artifacting, like a couple of scratches and pops here and there, but nothing major. The sound mastering is phenomenal on it. And I always thought that Music for Pleasure records might have been done pretty on the cheap and rushed out, but either that was not the case or they rushed out this one, but it happened to be mastered very well. I don't know, but the overall sound quality of it is fantastic. As for the songs that are on it, something I learned when I picked up this record is that American tastes and British tastes are a lot different from each other, because the hits that are on this, I knew of very, very few of them. The first song on the record is Never Ending Song of Love. Never heard of it. Turns out it was a hit for Delaney and Bonnie. It reached number 13 on the Billboard Hot 100. But the version on Smash Hits 71 is actually a re-recording of the New Seekers version. The New Seekers had a number 2 hit with it on the British singles chart from August 7th through September 4th of that year. And the version on this record actually sounds pretty dang close to the New Seekers. In fact, Soundhound actually thought it was the New Seekers, but it's not. Next up is Did You Ever? It's a song that I never heard of. The Shazam app identified the performer as Springbok, which is a South African band that usually did recordings like this, anonymous studio recordings of popular songs. Now, the reason the name Springbok came up was apparently because they were very prominent on Music for Pleasure records, partly because South Africa had a lot of Music for Pleasure distribution. So that's why we see that name coming up here. I actually sought out their version on YouTube, and it does sound very similar. This might actually be Springbok's version. As for the song Did You Ever, it was first released by Charlie Louvin. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation. It might be Louvin or something. And Melba Montgomery, they had a hit with it in 1971. But this is actually a remake of the version done by Nancy Sinatra and her longtime professional partner Lee Hazelwood. Did You Ever was a number 2 hit for them in August 1971 on the official singles chart in the UK, but it did not chart here in the United States. Now, interestingly, the song was written by Bobby Braddock, and usually the stuff that Nancy Sinatra sang was written by Lee Hazelwood. This was not written by Lee, despite him actually singing on it. It's a very country song, by the way.
Did you ever?
Not so much that you could notice.
Well, could you estimate how many?
8 or 9.
Song number 3 on side 1 is Mozart's Symphony 40, which is basically a slightly rock and roll version of a classical piece of music that happened every once in a while in the 70s, possibly most famously A Fifth of Beethoven by Walter Murphy. But this was a hit for Waldo de los Rio, and his version peaked at number 71 on the Billboard Hot 100 here in America, but in the UK, it was a number 5 hit. Now, the version that's on the Smash Hit 71 record, Shazam identified it as Sound Unlimited Orchestra, and Soundhound identified it as 101 Strings Orchestra. I can't vouch for Sound Unlimited Orchestra. I wasn't able to definitively find their version, but I can tell you this, the version that's on Smash Hit 71 is definitely not by 101 Strings. Next, we have Hot Love, and that was a number 1 hit from T-Rex in the UK from March 20th through April 24th, 1971. It only hit number 72 on the Billboard Hot 100 here in the States. Now, those of you listening in the United Kingdom, your T-Rex and our T-Rex were almost 2 completely different entities. From what I understand, he had multiple hits over in your part of the Atlantic Ocean, but over here in America, it was pretty much just bang a gong, get it on. I'm pretty sure people who are more into the AOR genre here in America might be more familiar with more of T-Rex's other songs, but in general, Bang a Gong, Get It On is the only song we know over here. Hot Love, not so much. It has a very similar melody to Bang a Gong. It's a little bit more bouncy, though.
Well, she's my woman of gold, and she's not very old.
The version that's on Smash Hit 71 is pretty close to the T-Rex version, very close. And then there's Knock 3 Times. That's the next song on side 1. Interestingly, Shazam identified it as Toca Tres Veces by the Music Makers, but it's definitely not that version. Soundhound actually thought it was Tony Orlando who had the original hit, although Tony Orlando and Dawn at the time were just simply called Dawn. The song was a number 1 hit on the Billboard Hot 100 in January 71, and it was a number 1 hit on the UK singles chart from May 15th through June 12th. Fun fact, by the way, Tony Orlando hates the song. He despises it. Wonder if that means that he hates all the money it made for him, too. And the final song, number 6 on side 1, is the most curious song for me in this album because I thought it had the most weirdest title. It's called Chirpy Chirpy Cheep Cheep. Soundhound thought it was performed by Springbok. I looked for Springbok's version to verify it. It turns out that I found 2 different versions by Springbok, and neither one matches what's on this record. But for whatever it's worth, the song was a number 1 hit on the UK singles chart for a Scottish band called Middle of the Road. It was a number 1 hit from June 19th through July 17th. I know that most of my listeners are from the United States, so I should give a little bit of background behind this rather quirky titled song. It's very bubblegummy. You've heard it in the beginning of this episode. It was written by English singer-songwriter Lally Stott and Giuseppe Cassia. And Lally Stott recorded it first, and it was released in Italy where he was living at the time. He was featured on a Dutch TV show called Top Pop, which featured him walking down a street, I think in Amsterdam, while lip syncing it. I'll link that in the show notes, by the way. But Stott's record label, which was Philips, didn't want to release the song outside of Italy because of the, well, pretty questionable lyrics. This is a very dippy bubblegum hit, but the lyrics are indeed kind of disturbing. It's literally about child abandonment.
Last night I heard my mama singing this song. Ooh, chirpy, chirpy, cheep, cheep. Woke up this morning and my mama was gone. Ooh, chirpy, chirpy, cheep, cheep, chirpy, chirpy, cheep, cheep, chirp.
So Philip's solution was, instead of releasing Lolly Stott's version overseas, they gave the song to Middle of the Road and a Trinidadian brother and sister singing duo called Mac and Katie Kissoon. Or is it Kissoon? I don't know. Never heard of these people. Don't know how it's pronounced. I apologize. I just want to share with you a couple of comments that some Facebook friends of mine made. My friend Russ, who currently lives in Florida, used to live in upstate New York, said that the song was a hit in Buffalo. Not sure which artist, but it was a hit. Interesting. My friend Bill says, and I quote, "Wildly cheerful for a song about parental abandonment. If you flip the record over, the first song you hear is I'm Still Waiting. And when I heard it, I thought, oh, this sounds like Diana Ross. Sure enough, it's a Diana Ross song, although obviously not performed by her on this album. It was a number one hit for her on the UK singles chart from August 21st through September 11th. Here in America, it only reached number 63 on the Billboard Hot 100, which kind of explains why I was not familiar with it. Now, the next song is another kind of cheeseball song that I had never heard before, probably because it wasn't really a hit over here in America. It's called Banner Man.
Glory, glory, glory. Listen to the band. Sing that same old story.
Shazam said that it was performed by Springbok on this record, and it's very likely their version. It sounds like their version of it, but it was a hit for a group called Blue Mink, who brought it to number 3 in May 1971 in the UK. It did not chart at all here in the US, but it sounds very patriotic, kind of like one of those United We Stand kind of songs that also came from England, I believe. The next song I am familiar with, unfortunately, I hate it. It's called Indiana Wants Me. It was a hit for R. Dean Taylor, and Soundhound thought that this was the R. Dean Taylor version of it. No, it was not. And it reached number 5 on Billboard here in the States in November of 1970, but in May 1971, it actually went to number 2 on the official UK singles chart. It frightens me that my own countrymen actually brought this song to number 5. And really, my friends over in England, you liked it that much that you brought it to number 2? Why? It's a really drippy song in which the narrator is a murderer on the lam, defending his wife's honor. Unlike the next song, the next one is also a song in which the narrator is on the lam for murder to protect his wife's honor. It's called I Did What I Did for Maria. It was a number 2 hit for Tony Christie in the UK. And in fact, it was sandwiched by Banner Man, which was at number 3, and Chirpy Chirpy Cheep Cheep, which was number 1 for at least 1 week on the charts. The next song in side 2 is one that I'm very familiar with, My Sweet Lord. Shazam identified this as being performed by Springbok, and it absolutely is Springbok's version of it. Obviously, it was a number 1 hit for George Harrison. It hit number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 on the week of December 26, 1970, and number 1 on the UK singles chart from January 30th through February 27th of 1971. The single was reissued shortly after George Harrison's death and hit number 1 again on the UK singles chart for the week of January 26, 2002, and number 94 on the Billboard Hot 100 around the same time. And I gotta say, this performance of My Sweet Lord by Springbok, it's okay, but it's kind of weak. The slide guitar sounds like, someone is just a little bit too shy, hard to describe. And what I was really curious about was how much of a clone would this version of the song be? Because, as most people familiar with My Sweet Lord are aware, the background singers sing the word hallelujah over and over, and then it kind of evolves into the Hare Krishna, Hare Rama chant, which, a lot of people know. But later on in the song, it then drifts into parts of the Vedic prayer, because, of course, George Harrison was very much into Eastern faiths and practiced a lot of Hindu and Hare Krishna principles. So he threw that into the song. What was Springbok gonna do with that Vedic prayer? Nowadays, you can just look it up. You can just Google My Sweet Lord and look for the lyrics, and you'll find out that that's what that is, the Vedic prayer. That's exactly how I found that out. In 1971, people did not have that option. You just had to know that it was the Vedic prayer. So what did Springbok do? Not the Vedic prayer. They just kept repeating hallelujah and the Hare Krishna chant.
My sweet Lord, my sweet Lord.
The final song is called Push Bike Song. And interestingly, when I tried to have SoundHound identify it, it identified the artist as Mr. Pickwick. I thought that was fascinating. But this was a number 2 hit for an Australian group called The Mixtures. What kept it out of number 1 on the UK singles chart? My Sweet Lord on January 31st. On YouTube, there's a video of The Mixtures lip-syncing this on Top of the Pops. And somebody put a caption in the video that reads, and I quote, "In a vicious act of retribution for sending them all those convicts, Australia sent us The Mixtures." Yeah, it is kind of a really dippy song. Here, let's hear a little bit of it.
Riding along on a pushback, honey, when I notice you. Riding downtown in a hurry, honey.
Very little of it, actually. Yeah, good grief. Yeah, there's a lot of that cornball stuff in this record. But there we go. That is what is on Smash Hits 71. Now, having said all that, let me share some record collecting thoughts with you. Now, my collecting topic for this episode isn't necessarily so much about collecting in and of itself. But let me explain, because nowadays when many people decide to get a new turntable, a common factor in deciding what make and model to get, USB connectivity. So I wanted to address that in case you're on the market for a record player and give you some ideas as to why you might want USB connectivity, or maybe even why it might not matter to you. First, why would USB matter to you? Well, obviously so that you can make a digital copy of your records in case you would want to listen to them, say, through your phone while jogging or driving or maybe even at work. That was indeed the case with a friend of mine back before USB was even considered an option for turntables. He had asked me if I could convert some of his vinyl to CD because he had some albums that had not yet gotten CD releases, and he'd like to listen to them on the way to work and back because his car only had a CD player. He couldn't just make cassette copies or anything. Well, I had everything necessary to do that. I could use a basic audio cable to run the output of the receiver into the sound card of my computer and record it with the parameters necessary for CD playback, 16 bits at 44.1 kilohertz. The only thing I couldn't do back then was promise that I could remove surface noises like clicks and pops and scratches and stuff. And he said, you know what, no problem. In fact, I kind of want those in because I'm so used to hearing that in these recordings, and I'd kind of like to hear that when I'm listening in my car. So, okay, cool. Of course, nowadays it's much easier to remove unwanted sounds with some of the features that you have in Audacity. And there's even some AI technology you can use to take out some noise. In fact, there's a website I might have mentioned before called Lalal.ai, And one of the records that I'm going to feature in an upcoming episode is a spoken word record that had a lot of clicks in it. So I ran it through La 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 and used the noise separator option, and it worked like a freaking charm. Ooh. But anyway, so my friend handed over the records that he wanted me to dump to CD. And it was essentially the entire Michael Nesmith post Monkees catalog, first National Band, second National Band, solo. And at the time, none of those were out on CD yet. If he had just waited a few years, he would have been able to get the CDs. But still, it was pretty cool that he wanted me to do that because I'd been meaning to check out Nesmith's post Monkees catalog, and I finally had a chance to do it, and I loved most of what I heard. Now, getting back to the topic, let me reiterate a couple of factors in this little story that you should consider if you really have your heart set on having USB output on your turntable. Number one, is what you want to digitize already available in some kind of digital format, like CD, streaming, downloads, etc.? And number two, maybe you already have the equipment necessary to digitize records, you don't realize it, and all you need is just the turntable. Let me address that second consideration first. You might not even need a USB output on your turntable, depending on what you already have. Does your computer have a standard audio input? Now, back when I digitized those Nesmith albums for my friend, I was using an Amiga 4000 computer. Man, I loved the Amiga platform so much. Oh, and I miss it. Anyway, my Amiga 4000 had a Prelude 16-bit sound card that had a standard RCA audio in. If you don't know what I mean by RCA, it's basically standard audio video cable. If you've ever owned an audio receiver, CD player, DVD player, VCR, external cassette player, you probably have at least 6 pairs of RCA cables laying around somewhere in your house. But RCA cables usually have a white plug for the left side of the stereo, red plug for the right, a yellow plug for video. Little secret, doesn't matter what you plug in, they're all going to work the same. Those are just guidelines. So anyway, when I recorded these records for my friend, I ran some super long RCA cables from the audio out of our Sony receiver in the living room and ran them into the RCA inputs of the sound card on my Amiga. And I set the recording parameters of whatever audio recording app I was using. It was an Amiga, so you know that was a long time ago. I don't remember which app it was, but regardless, I set the recording parameters to 16-bit stereo at 44.1 kilohertz, started the recording, and then edited the recording to split them up into individual songs and burn them to CD. And of course, burned copies for myself as well. Nowadays, most computer sound cards don't have RCA audio in, but instead just a single 1/8-inch audio input, basically the same as a headphone jack on a smartphone, iPad, Walkman. Oh, good grief, Walkman. Now I'm getting into old tech here. And yeah, I know people still use iPods. God knows I do. And the Walkman is making a comeback, but just stay with me, okay? So if your computer has any kind of audio input already, then you already have the technology that's necessary to digitize your records. You just need to make sure that you have the proper cables, which are easy enough to find at like Target, Walmart, Best Buy, or even just Walgreens or CVS, or I'm assuming for our friends in England, maybe Boots too. You also need an app that will record the sound for you. I've frequently talked about Audacity, including just minutes ago, and Audacity is a free and pretty powerful sound editor available on the 3 major platforms, Mac, Linux, and Windows. If you can do all that with what you already have, then you really don't need to worry about USB connectivity. The other thing to consider, does what you want to record off your records already exist digitally somewhere? Now, I'm not saying necessarily instead of digitizing your vinyl, go out and buy CDs, spending money on something that's going to take up space. Of course, I might recommend it for improved sound quality because you'll probably get better sound than from digitizing your vinyl. You'll get bonus tracks, you'll get liner notes, etc. But you could also check your public library for the CDs, or check various music download sources like Apple Music or iTunes, whatever they're calling it today. HD Tracks is a good source, Amazon Music, QO Buzz. See if they have digital versions of what you're thinking of recording. Again, you're probably going to have to fork over money for that. Or if what you're thinking of digitizing is a brand new release, it's not uncommon for a brand new record of music that's never been released before to come with a download code. So you can also download a digital copy of the record, eliminating the need to do any work other than to load the music onto whatever device you want to hear it on. I know a lot of record companies nowadays, they charge separate for downloads and for vinyl. I can tell you this much. I bought Tropica by the Tiki-Aki Orchestra a couple of years ago. I bought the vinyl, and I sent an email to the record label, and I said, hey, is there any way that I could get a digital download of this? And I got a response back from one of the guys in Tiki-Aki Orchestra, and he said, if you send me your invoice number, I'll send you a link. So I sent him the invoice number, and he sent me a link to a Bandcamp page that had the entire album on lossless audio. It wasn't even MP3. It was like FLAC, I think. And it was great. I was thankful to have that. It wasn't even yeah, when there's a lossless option, try to go for that over MP3. It'll sound better. But anyway, I'll also let you in on this little secret. Sometimes if I buy a brand new piece of music on vinyl and it does not include a digital download, I'll see if it's on YouTube. And if it is, instead of digitizing the vinyl myself, I will go to YouTube, get the video, and use a video downloader plugin to download the video. And I'll just convert it to 16-bit 44.1 kilohertz audio so I can listen to it on my phone, listen to it on my iPod, and it works like a charm. In a bit, I'll tell you why I do that instead of just digitizing the record myself. But having said all that, even if a title you want to digitize is already available digitally, you might want to give that digital version a listen before you spend money or time grabbing it. I'll give you an example. I always love using the Beatles as an example, and I'm going to do that right now too. If you're a Beatles fan and you're intimately familiar with, say, Strawberry Fields Forever from the stereo version of the U.S. Capitol Records release of the Magical Mystery Tour album, you're going to have a different listening experience if you listen to any digital version of it that's been available since 1987. Why? Well, quite simply because the U.S. version of Magical Mystery Tour had a mix of Strawberry Fields Forever that wasn't available anywhere else but that and the U.S. version of the so-called Blue Album, 1967 to 1970. Otherwise, you couldn't get it anywhere else. In 1987, when the Beatles catalog was standardized so that you didn't have separate US releases, Japanese, and all that, they were all just one universal release, the version of Magical Mystery Tour that they used was not the US Capitol Records version, but the version that was released in Germany on Odeon Records. Why did they go with that one instead of the Capitol version? Because the German version, every single song was in stereo. That was not the case with the Capitol US Magical Mystery Tour. 3 of the songs were in mono or fake stereo, but the folks at Apple Records wanted 100% stereo for that release. The German mix of Strawberry Fields Forever is different from the American mix, and I noticed it immediately. I still love both equally, but I also kind of missed the American mix. So if I want to listen to the American version, I have to listen to a version that was digitized from vinyl or cassette or maybe even 8-track or reel-to-reel. A bigger example I can think of, Pac-Man Fever by Buckner and Garcia. Yeah, Gen X video game fans such as myself, we had this album when we were little kids. The album has since been reissued on CD, and I believe it's also available on streaming services and download services, but the digital version, including the CD version, is a completely new re-recording. When it came time for Pac-Man Fever to come out on CD, there were some legal issues that prevented them from using the original master, so Jerry Buckner and the sadly now departed Gary Garcia went back and re-recorded each track from scratch, including the sound effects. So if you were to listen to the Pac-Man Fever CD, it would sound vastly different from what you remember from the 80s. So what's your solution if you want to listen to the Pac-Man Fever that you knew and loved as a child on your iPod, on your phone, in your car? Got to digitize it from vinyl. So that's something you got to consider as well. Check not only if a digital version of what you want to record from your vinyl already exists, but also if it's a version that you'll be happy with listening to. So getting back to that YouTube hack I mentioned earlier, why do I do that when I have the ability to just record the vinyl digitally myself? Well, a few reasons. Keep in mind, most music nowadays, and in fact, since probably around 1982, has been recorded digitally on computers. So it kind of makes sense for playback on devices other than turntables to kind of seek out a digital version of what was recorded digitally. Fun fact, by the way, remember I mentioned Tikiyaki Orchestra a few minutes? The album that I bought from them was recorded both on tape and digitally. They ran reel-to-reel tape while they were recording digitally. So that way, if you wanted the vinyl version, you had a fully analog version of it. That's really cool. Also, when you record your vinyl, you're still going to have a generation loss, just like you would if you were recording something to a cassette tape. But if you get a digital copy of something, there's no loss in generation. You're not going to have hiss added to the sound every time you make a copy of it. And also, downloading and converting a YouTube video is much less time-consuming than connecting the USB to my laptop, recording the vinyl, splitting the recordings up into individual tracks, trimming the excess audio off the beginning and the end, filtering out the surface noise, etc. But for me, the big reason that I'm tending to look at YouTube now instead of just making my own digital recording of the vinyl is the surface noise, to be quite honest. Let me explain here. You're always going to have some surface noise when recording from a record. You're going to have a couple of pops and clicks now and then, even if your record is clean and static free. There's just still something you're not going to get 100% on usually. And also, in my case, I get the sounds of the motor running as well. I've mentioned before that my turntable is an Audio-Technica LP1240 and it has USB output. If you're familiar with Audio-Technica's popular LP120 model, the 1240 is basically the same, but it has a few extra features on it. The problem I have with the 1240 that I did not have with the LP120 is that the USB recordings pick up a lot of noise, and it's probably because of the preamp. The LP1240 has a built-in preamp that you can switch on and off, but when you record from the USB, you have to turn on the preamp, and the built-in preamp is very, very super sensitive. Now, when I'm listening to records normally, our Sony receiver has its own built-in preamp, so I actually disable the preamp on the turntable. But for USB recordings, I have to turn it on, of course. And in those recordings, you hear everything. If you walk around, the vibrations from the floor might actually come across in the recording. USB recordings that I make, again, they pick up the sound of the motor, so there's a hum. I mean, yeah, I can use the noise reduction feature in Audacity to filter out the hum, but the problem with doing that is that it often affects the overall sound of the recording, especially on quieter passages in music recordings. It's not a huge deal with spoken word recordings usually, but even then I found that using La 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 is much better for spoken word recordings. So that's another thing to consider when determining whether you need USB technology on your turntable. There's that risk of extra noise coming through. It might not be a big deal to you. It might not be, but for some people it is. It might not be an issue on all turntables, but it's definitely an issue with mine. One possible solution to my problem might be to not use the turntable's USB at all, but instead route the audio from the receiver into my computer via a standalone external digital audio converter, which I bought from Amazon a couple of years ago for like $15 or so. But yeah, these are some considerations when shopping for a turntable with USB in mind. Do you need the USB connectivity? Is what you want from your vinyl already available digitally in some form? Might you already have the necessary equipment to record vinyl in the first place? But of course, one thing to think about, even if you do have the equipment and what you have on vinyl is already available digitally, is it just simpler personally for you to record from USB and be done with it? For some people it is. Then by all means, get a turntable with USB. If you don't want USB, it doesn't matter. If you don't want to use the USB, just don't use it. But as I like to tell people when they ask me about turntables, Does what you have or what you're looking in to get do what you want it to do, and is it good enough for you? And if so, then it's perfectly fine. For those of you who've never heard this podcast before, I like to rate and kind of rank the records that I talk about on my Weird Record Collection, and they each get rated on 5 categories with a potential score of 1 through 5 each inclusive. And in case it's not apparent to you, the 5 is basically more intense, 1 is less intense. So basically, overall, there is a composite score potential of 5 through 25 inclusive. The first category that I rate on is either local interest or usefulness, but since there's nothing really terribly local about this record in particular, I'm going to stick to usefulness. Well, what is Smash Hits 71 useful for? No, I'm not going to suggest using it as a clay pigeon substitute. Honestly, I can only think of one possible use for this record in terms of the reason for its existence. If you want a bunch of songs that were UK hits in 1971 and don't want to pay a lot of money for that compilation, and you don't mind that the songs are not by the actual artists, but still overall performed by a reasonably okay facsimile. But given that's really the only real use, I can't give this record a high rating on usefulness, so I will rate it 2 out of 5 for usefulness. Historical interest. Well, all I can say is that an album of anonymous studio musicians recreating hits isn't exactly historical. It was a pretty common practice back in the 60s, 70s, and possibly even the 80s. And that I only paid £1 for it in a used record store doesn't really help things any for being a historically interesting record. However, there does seem to be a bit of a cult following with music for pleasure in general, so I can't just plain sink the rating as a 1, so I will rate the historical interest factor a 2. I also rate records on their uniqueness, uniquity, uniquedom, whatever. Assuming there's a degree of uniqueness, which I think by definition there isn't, but I don't care. My podcast, my rule, bam. I can't really say there's much unique about Smash Hits 71. At the time, MFP was not the only label doing knockoff records. Music for Pleasure wasn't exactly an obscure label, nor were its releases. Going down to the album itself, as of the day I record this, there are 211 copies reportedly owned by Discogs.com users, myself included, and 44 copies for sale. I saw 16 copies offered up for sale on eBay, ranging in price from about $3 to over $50. This was auto-converted to dollars. I don't know what it was in pounds, but anyway, I only saw 1 copy on Etsy, 2 on Amazon.com, one for $43 and another for $246. I'm thinking of contacting the vendor of that copy and offering mine for half that. And I also saw 2 on Amazon.co.uk. Any way that I slice it, I don't see anything unique about this record, so I'm rating its uniqueness value a 1. And my friends, because this podcast is called My Weird Record Collection, I certainly must rate the weirdness of the record. Well, let's examine the situation here. We have a record from the UK that has only 12 songs of average pop song length. The standard in the UK is 14. Apparently, the reason they kept it down to 12 was because of some kind of royalty issues. So that it only has 12 songs is kind of weird. It's a bit weird. But beyond that, it's an album with front and back cover photos of a scantily clad woman holding a frightened-looking baby. Nothing on the album makes any reference to the performers of the hit versions of the songs, or even who actually performs on the record. And there are 2 songs in a row in which the narrator is a murderer on the lam, followed by a song that literally contains a prayer. That's pretty weird, isn't it? And again, a cult following exists for records like this, specifically on this label, in which the actual followers of that cult admit that the records are kind of weird. Not the weirdest kind of record you can find, but still a lot of weirdness as a whole, Ergo, my weirdness rating for Smash Hits 71 gets 4 out of 5 from me. And finally, enjoyability. If I'm being totally honest, despite the concept behind this album and other similar ones, it's not really a bad listen if you like these kinds of songs. I'm not a fan of the cheesy bubblegum stuff that makes up a lot of the album, but really, it's not bad. Of course, if I'm going to listen to My Sweet Lord, my go-to is going to be George Harrison's version, or maybe even Billy Preston's version. And I won't exactly be crying in my Guinness if I live for 300 more years and never again hear Indiana Wants Me performed by anybody. But the record is objectively not a bad listen, so I'll give it a 3 for enjoyability. So to recap my ratings, 2 out of 5 each for usefulness and historical interest, 1 for uniqueness, 4 for weirdness, and 3 for enjoyability. That gives Smash Hits 71 a composite rating of 12 out of 25, making it the second lowest rated record I've discussed in this podcast so far, placing it 1 notch above Sidney Omar's Libra, sorry Sidney, that record, and 1 notch below another British import, background music for your home movies. And that, my friends, was Smash Hits 71 on the Music for Pleasure label out of England. Do you have any thoughts on this record or anything else that's relevant to this podcast? Well, my email address is myweirdrecords@fab4it.com. Fab4it is spelled F-A-B, the number 4, and then I-T. The website for this podcast, by the way, is just like the email address, except instead of an @sign, it is a dot. So myweirdrecords.fab4it.com. And if you go to that site, you will have links to certain resources, like where you can get certain accessories I like to talk about, and you can look at past episodes. I'm going to try to come up with some more features for that site. If you have any thoughts, just let me know. And also, there's a link in which you can help support this podcast financially, and that is a link that says Buy Me a Coffee. If you like what you hear, hey, buy me a coffee, except I don't like coffee. I'll probably get a hot chocolate or something. But anywho, going back to how you can reach out to me, I am on the major social networks with the handle My Weird Records. Blue Sky, I know it's whatever the default server is, what myweirdrecords.bsky.social. I think that's what it is. But anywho, I'm there. I'm on Twitter, Instagram. I know I have a account at Hive, but darned if I actually use that thing. I really should. But anywho, you can also find this podcast on Facebook. Just search for My Weird Record Collection, or you can go to facebook.com/myweirdrecords. You can also access this podcast on YouTube. You'll find not only episodes of this podcast, but also every once and again, I do occasional extra videos. Like recently, I uploaded a video in which I demonstrate a really nerdy coding project I did related to Discogs.com. So if you're into software development or are curious about it, you can look at that. Or if you want to learn more about how Discogs.com works, you can go to that as well. Either way, it's win-win. Also, whenever possible, I post audio of the records that I discuss on YouTube. And if I don't, it means that chances are either number 1, I didn't have time to upload them, or number 2, more likely somebody else already uploaded the audio and I will just link to that audio. But go to YouTube, you can look for My Weird Record Collection, or you can go directly to youtube.com/@My Weird Record Collection in your favorite web browser. And by the way, friends, the sounds and music used in this podcast are the properties of their respective copyright holders and are used for commentary and review. Infringement is not intended. As usual, I offer a big thanks to my friend Tim Christ, also known as Shoebox, also known as Worm Quartet. Tim was kind enough to let me use his record, the Pac-Man EP, as kind of the grounds for the logo for this podcast. So if you look at the logo, you see kind of a weird looking record. That is actually the Pac-Man EP. I highly, highly, highly recommend checking out Tim's music. You can go to his website at worm-quartet.web.app, especially if you like to laugh. Special thanks also to my buddy Kevin Zerb. Kevin, thank you so much for designing the actual logo artwork for this podcast. And Kevin and his music and his podcasts, including his new podcast, Mono, you can go to his website, which is zerbinator.com, to get all that stuff. And for those of you listening in the present, that's going to be May. And I remember last May, I covered a record called They're at the Post, which is literally a game. Well, I'm going to do another game next month. It's going to be a trivia game this time. So if you're into that kind of thing, listen to episode 18. And if you're not into that kind of thing, I don't care. Listen anyway. Anyway, thank you for listening, everybody. And I am reminding you, please support your local record store. Bye-bye. But getting back to music for pleasure, interestingly, my notes say getting back to music for pleasure, also known as music for pleasure. Nice to know that went by two names that happen to look exactly alike.